A woman kneels by a fire, in her hands a small clay bowl filled with crushed seeds. She's not cooking, she's not healing a wound. She's about to breathe in smoke that will completely change what her mind experiences on purpose. This isn't a modern habit, this isn't a weekend indulgence. Archaeologists have found residue from psychoactive plants in pottery over 10,000 years old. Seeds burned deliberately, far from any cooking fire. So the question was never really whether ancient people used drugs, it's how far back that choice actually goes, and just how deliberate it really was. For a long time, the popular image of prehistoric humans was simple, almost cartoonish. Hunt, eat, sleep, survive. Nothing extra, nothing indulgent, certainly nothing that looked like a deliberate search for a different state of mind. That image made a certain kind of sense. Life was hard, resources were scarce, and every calorie mattered. Why would anyone burn precious effort chasing an altered state of consciousness when simply staying alive already took everything they had? But that assumption started collapsing the moment archaeologists began looking specifically for chemical residue. Instead of just tools and bones, the shift came from a change in method as much as a change in mindset. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists studying ancient sites focused on what they could see with the naked eye. Broken pottery, stone tools, bones, the physical remains of daily life. Anything chemical, anything that had long since evaporated or decomposed, was effectively invisible to that kind of analysis. That changed with the arrival of residue analysis, a set of techniques capable of detecting trace chemical compounds absorbed into porous materials like pottery, stone, and even ancient dental plaque, sometimes surviving for thousands of years in concentrations too small to see, but not too small to measure. Suddenly, artifacts that had been sitting in museum drawers for decades, dismissed as ordinary cooking vessels, started testing positive for compounds that had no business being in a cooking vessel at all. In a cave in Israel, at a site called Rakafet, researchers found stone mortars containing the residue of fermented, alcoholic beverages dated to roughly 13,000 years ago, before farming existed, before permanent settlements existed, before writing, before pottery, before almost everything we associate with civilization. People were brewing alcohol before they were growing wheat. Some researchers now argue the reverse of the old assumption might be closer to the truth, that the desire to reliably produce fermented beverages may have been one of the pressures that pushed early humans toward deliberately cultivating grain in the first place, rather than fermentation simply arriving as a lucky byproduct once farming was already established. That single detail forces a very different question than the one most people assume. It's not just about survival needs slowly leaving room for to have been part of the picture from nearly the beginning. Luxury later on. In some cases, altering the mind appears long before anyone wrote down a word about it. People were already leaving evidence in the one place they couldn't hide it from their own bodies. Rock art dating back roughly 7,000 to 9,000 years shows figures covered in what? And the walls around them. In the Sahara, in a region called Tassili N'Ajjer, look like mushroom motifs, some sprouting directly from their bodies, arms raised in what researchers interpret as ritual or trance-like poses. It's not definitive proof of psilocybin use. Rock art rarely offers definitive proof of anything, but the imagery is specific enough and repeated often enough across multiple sites that most researchers studying it don't think it's decorative. Half a world away in the Andes, the evidence gets considerably more direct. Archaeologists studying ancient burial sites in South America have found chewed coca leaf quids, still lodged between the teeth of remains, dated to roughly 8,000 years ago. Not leaves that were simply present nearby. Leaves that had clearly been chewed, worked, held in the mouth deliberately, the same way coca is still used today across parts of the Andes for energy, altitude sickness, and endurance. And in what is now Iraq, cuneiform tablets from ancient Sumer, dating back roughly 5,000 years, contain one of the earliest written references to a substance most people today would instantly recognize. The Sumerians called the opium poppy hulgil, which translates, roughly, to the joy plant. That name alone tells you something important. This wasn't a plant discovered by accident and quietly ignored. It was named, cultivated, and clearly understood well enough to be associated directly with a specific feeling. The pattern shows up in China as well, in the Yanghai tombs, located in what is now the Xinjiang region. Archaeologists uncovered nearly 2 pounds of cannabis, dated to roughly 2,700 years ago, buried directly alongside a man believed to have held a shamanic role within his community. The cannabis had been carefully cleaned of seeds and stems before burial, a detail suggesting it had been specifically prepared for psychoactive use, rather than simply harvested for fiber or food, which were the more common uses of the plant elsewhere in the ancient world at the time. The pattern doesn't stop there, either. In parts of what is now the southwestern United States, pipes recovered from sites dating back roughly 3,000 years have tested positive for nicotine. Residue, evidence of deliberate tobacco use long before European contact, likely tied to ceremonial and spiritual practice rather than casual daily habit. And across South and Southeast Asia, chemical staining on ancient teeth, along with the discovery of purpose-built stone tools for pounding, plant material, points to betel nut chewing going back at least 4,000 years, a mildly stimulating habit still practiced by hundreds of millions of people today. What's striking isn't just how old each individual example is, it's how many completely separate regions of the world, with no contact with one another, seem to have arrived at strikingly similar behavior, identifying a specific plant, refining a specific method of preparation, and building it into the fabric of daily or ceremonial life. By the time Sumerian scribes were pressing wedge-shaped symbols into wet clay to record the term hulgil, opium poppy cultivation was likely already an established practice, not a recent discovery. Later Egyptian medical texts, including the famous Eber's Papyrus, describe opium preparations used specifically to quiet crying infants, a detail that tells us something uncomfortable, but revealing this wasn't treated as an exotic ritual substance reserved for the sacred few. It had already become practical, every day, woven into ordinary domestic life. That transition, from a substance reserved for ceremony to one used in daily practical circumstances, appears again and again throughout the archaeological record. It suggests these plants weren't just tools for reaching altered states during special occasions. Over time, many of them became something closer to ordinary technology woven quietly into pain relief, into caregiving, into the practical machinery of daily survival, sitting right alongside their more dramatic ceremonial uses. Here's where the story gets more interesting than a simple list of old drugs. Because the deeper researchers dig, the clearer it becomes that early humans weren't just stumbling onto psychoactive plants and eating them out of curiosity once. They were identifying specific effects, refining specific methods, and passing that knowledge down deliberately, generation after generation. Take the opium poppy again. Growing the plant is one thing, but extracting a usable, consistent dose from it requires a fairly precise process, scoring the seed pod at exactly the right stage of maturity, collecting the sap before it dries out completely, letting it oxidize under specific conditions. That's not a process you discover once by accident. That's a process you refine over repeated attempts, remember carefully, and teach to someone else. The same pattern shows up with fermentation. Making alcohol isn't as simple as leaving fruit out and hoping for the best. Not if you want something consistently drinkable rather than something that just happened to rot in a useful direction. Early brewers were controlling temperature, timing, and ingredients closely enough to produce results reliable enough to base rituals and ceremonies around. And then there's the question of why. Because almost everywhere researchers find evidence of early psychoactive substance use, they find it tangled up with something bigger than simple pleasure-seeking. Grief rituals, coming-of-age ceremonies, attempts to communicate with the dead or with something beyond ordinary. Experience entirely. Moments, in other words, when ordinary language and ordinary perception seem to fall short of what a community actually needs to process or express. In parts of ancient Peru, residue analysis on ceremonial vessels has revealed traces consistent with brews made from plants containing powerful psychoactive compounds, similar in principle to what's known today as ayahuasca. These vessels weren't found in ordinary household contexts. They were found in and around ceremonial structures, alongside other objects clearly reserved for significant, non-everyday occasions. which suggests something worth sitting with. These substances weren't treated as an escape from ordinary life. They were treated as a doorway into something considered more important than ordinary life. There's another detail that reinforces just how deliberate this all was. Preparing many of these substances wasn't just labor-intensive, it was often genuinely risky. The San Pedro cactus, used in parts of the Andes for at least 3,000 years based on carved stone effigies and residue evidence, contains mescaline in concentrations that shift significantly depending on the specific part of the plant, its age, and how it's prepared. Getting the dose wrong isn't a minor inconvenience. It requires exactly the kind of careful, tested, generation-to-generation knowledge that doesn't survive by accident. The same holds for khat, a stimulant plant chewed fresh across parts of the Horn of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula for well over 1,000 years, based on both botanical evidence and early written accounts. Khat loses its potency within days of harvesting, which means sustained use depended on a reliable, ongoing supply chain, cultivation, transport, and timing, coordinated deliberately across an entire community, not a one-time discovery that happened to work out once. There's a broader pattern worth sophisticated botanical knowledge for entirely different purposes, identifying which plants could stun fish for easier. Noting here, too, across many of these same ancient societies, people were simultaneously developing equally. Catching, which could treat infection, which were fatal in even small quantities. Psychoactive plant use wasn't an isolated pocket of expertise, oddly advanced compared to everything around it. It was one branch of a much wider, deeply detailed understanding of the plant world that early humans were building constantly, out of necessity, across every part of daily survival. None of this fits comfortably into the old picture of primitive people randomly eating whatever plants happen to be nearby and hoping for the best. It looks a great deal more like accumulated, tested, transmitted expertise. The same basic process by which any specialized human knowledge survives across generations. There's one more piece of this puzzle worth examining closely, because it explains how this kind of knowledge managed to survive at all across thousands of years, without writing to record it. In many of these ancient societies, the preparation and administration of psychoactive substances wasn't left to just anyone. It was frequently controlled by a specific role, a shaman, a healer, a ritual specialist, someone whose position within the community was defined, at least in part, by exactly this kind of expertise. That detail matters more than it might seem to, at first. A specialized role like that doesn't emerge around something trivial or accidental. It emerges around knowledge valuable enough, and dangerous enough if handled poorly, that a community decides it needs to be concentrated in specific, trusted hands rather than left to individual guesswork. Burial evidence supports this pattern remarkably well. Across multiple ancient sites on different continents, archaeologists have identified graves containing unusually elaborate collections of ritual objects, paraphernalia associated with psychoactive substances, and preparation tools, buried alongside individuals who were clearly treated with distinct ceremonial significance compared to those around them. In several cases, researchers interpret these as the graves of ritual specialists specifically, people whose social status was tied directly to their command over altered states of consciousness. If altering the mind had simply been a minor, incidental behavior, it's difficult to explain why entire specialized social roles would form around managing it. Generation after generation across cultures that never had any contact with each other. This kind of specialization also solves a practical problem that pure trial and error never could. Many of these substances sit on a genuinely narrow line between a meaningful, altered state and serious physical harm, sometimes even death, depending on dose, preparation, and the individual taking them. Without a dedicated keeper of that knowledge, someone whose entire social function revolved around getting it right, the margin for fatal mistakes across a community would have been far too wide to sustain safely over centuries. Concentrating that expertise in specific trusted individuals and passing it down deliberately rather than leaving each new generation to rediscover it independently was likely the only way this kind of practice could survive as long as it clearly did. It's a pattern that echoes, in a strange way, right into the present. Modern societies still tend to restrict access, to powerful psychoactive substances still tend to require training, licensing, or ritual context before certain uses are considered acceptable. The specific mechanisms have changed almost completely: laws instead of lineage, institutions instead of individual shamans. But the underlying logic looks remarkably familiar. Powerful enough to matter deeply, powerful enough to require careful hands. Here is the part of this story that quietly reframes everything that came before it. We tend to imagine our prehistoric ancestors as creatures purely driven by necessity: find food, avoid danger, reproduce, survive. Anything beyond that gets mentally filed under modern luxury, modern excess, something that arrived only once survival stopped being a full-time job. But the evidence doesn't really support that separation. Altering consciousness deliberately and repeatedly appears to be something people were doing before agriculture, before cities, before almost every marker we usually associate with civilization arriving. It wasn't waiting for humanity to become comfortable enough to afford it, which raises an uncomfortable but fascinating possibility. Maybe the drive to alter one's own mind isn't a byproduct of modern boredom or modern stress at all. Maybe it's something closer to a basic feature of how human minds are built: a need to occasionally step outside ordinary perception, whether to process grief, to mark a threshold moment, to feel connected to something larger, or simply to experience being alive from a different angle for a while. Every culture researchers have studied deeply enough across every continent seems to have found its own version of that doorway, whether it was fermented grain, chewed leaves, burned seeds, or brewed roots. Different substances, different rituals, wildly different environments. The same underlying impulse, showing up again and again, independently, all over the world. That kind of consistency doesn't usually happen by coincidence. Modern neuroscience actually offers a possible explanation for why that impulse might run so deep. Researchers studying altered states of consciousness, whether induced by fasting, rhythmic drumming, extreme physical exertion, or psychoactive substances, have found that many of these states activate strikingly similar patterns of brain activity, particularly in regions associated with the sense of self and how rigidly the brain separates internal experience from the outside world. In other words, the brain may already contain the machinery for this kind of experience, sitting dormant, waiting for the right trigger to access it. If that's accurate, then psychoactive plants weren't necessarily introducing something foreign into the human mind. They may have simply been one of the more reliable, repeatable keys early humans found for unlocking a door that was already built into the architecture of human consciousness itself. That would help explain why the impulse shows up so consistently in cultures with no shared history, no shared language, and often no shared plants available to them at all. Different keys, quite possibly, for the same underlying lock. It also reframes what these ancient practices might actually represent. Not a primitive misunderstanding of chemistry, waiting patiently to be replaced by modern medicine and modern recreation. More like an early, remarkably sophisticated form of experimentation conducted directly on the one instrument. Every human society has always had immediate access to the human mind itself, tested and refined the same patient way any other technology gets tested and refined, through repetition, observation, and knowledge carried forward across generations. So picture that woman by the fire again. Crushed seeds in a clay bowl. Smoke rising with clear intention, not carelessness. Somewhere nearby, people waiting, watching. Part of whatever moment is about to unfold. She isn't a primitive figure stumbling blindly into an accident of chemistry. She's a person making a deliberate choice, using knowledge passed down carefully for a purpose her community understood and valued enough to preserve across generations. Somewhere behind her, perhaps, is the person who taught her exactly how much to use and exactly when. And beyond that person, further back than any record will ever recover, someone else who taught them the very same thing. 10,000 years later, the specific substances have changed almost beyond recognition. The rituals look nothing alike on the surface, but underneath all of it, something remarkably old is still running quietly in the background, the same basic human impulse. To reach for something that shifts the mind, if only for a while, in search of relief, connection, or meaning. It's worth remembering, too, that this same impulse has always carried real risk alongside it. Then just as much as now, the line between careful, controlled ritual use and genuine harm was never guaranteed automatically, and plenty of archaeological and historical evidence suggests ancient societies grappled openly with that same tension, building rules, restrictions, and specific roles precisely because the Substances involved were powerful enough to cause real damage when handled carelessly. The impulse itself may be ancient and deeply human. The need to treat it with real caution appears to be exactly as old. Maybe that's the real answer buried in this story. Not a fixed date or a single first substance, or one specific moment humans supposedly crossed some invisible line. Just a question that's been quietly present for as long as we have records of people at all. What are we willing to reach for to feel, even briefly? Sitting underneath every era, every culture, every fire ever lit for exactly this reason. Like something more than what an ordinary day allows.